Imagine the morning of July 4th, 1776, across the colonies. Bells rang, cannons boomed, and white Americans poured into streets, taverns, and public squares to celebrate a newfound freedom. The air buzzed with excitement. Speeches were prepared, flag waved proudly, and glasses clinked in toasts to liberty. It was a day many would remember as the birth of a nation, a moment when independence and self-rule were finally within reach. But for nearly 500,000 black men, women, and children, that same morning held no celebration. They remained in chains, forced into labor, and watched as the promises of liberty unfolded around them, promises that explicitly did not include them. Picture plantation at sunrise. Enslaved workers rose before the sun, tending fields, holding water, and performing back-breaking tasks, all while the sounds of freedom bells ringing, drums beating, musket fire echoed in the distance. Some were aware that a monumental event was unfolding, while others simply knew that their work would not stop. No matter what the white colonists celebrated, the words "all men are created equal" were spoken in town squares, recited in newspapers, and toasted at tables. Yet for those in bondage, these words were hollow, a cruel reminder of reality they could not escape. Even in northern cities, where a small number of black people were free, life was far from the liberty being celebrated. Free black men worked the hardest, lowest-paying jobs. Free black women carried out domestic work, all while navigating constant threats of harassment, false accusations, or the possibility that a child or loved one could be taken away. Freedom existed for them only on paper. In practice, it was fragile, conditional, and always at risk. And yet, hope found its way into the hearts of many. Some enslaved individuals wondered if the revolutionary struggle might one day include them. Could the ideals of liberty, equality, and rights ever extend beyond white men to those whose labor had built the very nation they were fighting to free? That hope was risky, but it was also a lifeline. Secret conversations, whispered dreams, and subtle acts of defiance, deliberately slow work, feigned illness, or small acts of resistance became ways to assert humanity in a system designed to strip it away. On this, the contrast was impossible to ignore. White Americans celebrated their independence, while black Americans, both enslaved and free, confronted the harsh truth. The revolution did not recognize them. It was a time of contradictions, of joy and pain, of liberty proclaimed for some and denied to others. Yet even in that disparity, there was resilience. Even in silence, there was resistance. Even in chains, there was dreaming of a freedom that one day, generations later, would be claimed fully. If you want to uncover more stories of courage, resilience, and history often left untold, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you won't miss any of the powerful stories we share. Today, we explore not just a day of celebration, but a day of awakening, a moment in history that reminds us whose voices were silenced, whose struggles were ignored, and how those same voices, through generations, would rise to claim the freedom they were denied. Learn from the past, reflect on whose liberty we celebrate, and join us as we uncover the untold stories of July 4th, 1776. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the Virginia fields on that fateful morning of July 4th, 1776, the world was already in motion. White colonists, dressed in their finest coats, prepared speeches, arranged breakfast tables, and polished the brass of their newly raised flags, anticipating the celebration of a freedom they had fought so hard to claim. In the streets of Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. The air buzzed with excitement. Musket fire echoed from distant encampments. Drums beat in rhythm, and liberty bells rang in town squares, proclaiming a new era of self-rule. The scent of roasting meats, fresh bread, and inked proclamations mingled in the warm summer air, a promise of independence tangible in every corner. Yet just miles away, the reality was starkly different for the nearly 500,000 black men, women, and children whose lives were chained to labor, servitude, and the relentless demands of a world that refused to see them as human. Before the sun had fully crested the horizon, enslaved men and women were already stirring in the dim light of dawn, their limbs stiff with sleep and their spirits burdened by the knowledge that this day, like every other, offered them no respite. On sprawling plantations, they moved silently through the fields, hands blistered and backs bent under the weight of tools and water buckets. Their work dictated not by choice, but by the unyielding authority of their enslavers. Some tended rows of tobacco or cotton, the soil under their fingers a constant reminder of the chains that bound them, while others carried out domestic duties, preparing meals for families who would later toast to the very liberty the laborers could never taste. The rhythmic sound of their labor, the scraping of hoes against earth, the pounding of mortar, the clatter of pots and pans in kitchen hearths was a soundtrack to a freedom they were never allowed to claim, an unspoken tension hovering in the sweltering air. As the morning unfolded, the distant hum of celebration reached their ears. Bells tolled in town squares, and the cadence of drums carried across fields and city streets, each beat a stark contrast to the monotony and toil of their own existence. Fireworks, though invisible from many plantation corners, would later paint the sky in bursts of color, dazzling celebrations that excluded those whose hands had built the wealth being displayed. In northern cities where some black individuals lived free, the contrast was equally jarring. Free black men hauled heavy barrels along docks, scrubbed streets under the watchful gaze of townspeople, and labored in workshops where their skills were exploited yet their humanity questioned. Free black women worked in kitchens and laundries, their hands shaping meals and clothing for families who raised glasses to the ideals of liberty and equality, while the looming threat of harassment, legal persecution, or even kidnapping never left their minds. Even freedom, it seemed, was a fragile veneer, a social contract that could be stripped away in an instant by prejudice, misfortune, or the whims of those who had the power to enforce inequality. In the midst of their labor, some enslaved individuals dared to listen closely to the conversations drifting from the manor houses, taverns, and meeting halls. Words like liberty, rights, and independence hovered in the air, tantalizing and cruel, almost mocking their very existence. A field worker pausing for a breath might overhear white colonists discussing the overthrow of British tyranny, unaware that the tyranny in which he labored daily was closer to home. A cook in a Philadelphia household might hear the laughter of celebrants as they raised toasts to self-governance, while she stirred a pot of stew, contemplating the ways her own children remained bound by laws that counted them as property rather than people. These moments were a bitter reminder of the contradiction at the heart of the day, a celebration of freedom built on the subjugation of others. Yet, even under such harsh conditions, hope and subtle defiance persisted. Enslaved men and women, despite exhaustion and oppression, found ways to assert small pieces of autonomy. A plow might be broken intentionally, a tool misplaced, a chore performed deliberately, small acts that communicated resistance without provoking the full wrath of an enslaver. Whispers shared under the shade of trees, stories passed down quietly, and songs sung in secret became threads of continuity and identity. Spirituals and African melodies carried coded messages of survival, resilience, and the longing for a day when chains would no longer define their lives. These cultural expressions were more than mere entertainment. They were acts of defiance, lifelines connecting the present to a history of resistance and a future of possibility. For the free black population, the day was no less fraught with complexity. Even those legally recognized as free faced the constant vigilance of a society that questioned their presence, their rights, and their very legitimacy. Laws required registration and documentation. Any lapse could result in accusations that might see them stripped of freedom, kidnapped, or worse. Their labor, often just as grueling as that of enslaved people, fed into the economic and social structures that celebrated liberty for white Americans, a painful irony not lost on those who endured it. Some free black men worked to save pennies to buy property or support their families, while free women navigated social spaces carefully, balancing survival against subtle expressions of pride and resistance. In the shadows of July 4th celebrations, these small but determined acts of autonomy quietly challenged the prevailing narrative that liberty was reserved solely for white citizens. Through the long hours, as the sun climbed high and the sounds of revelry echoed ever louder, enslaved and free black individuals alike navigated a world of contradiction. They lived among symbols of freedom they could never claim, performed labor for the very people celebrating liberty, and yet nurtured an enduring sense of identity, resilience, and hope. Every swing of the hoe, every polished dish, every whispered story and song became part of a quiet rebellion, a claim to humanity and dignity in a world determined to deny it. That July 4th, 1776, was not a day of celebration for them, but a day of endurance, of subtle resistance, and of dreams that would ripple across generations and eventually transform the meaning of freedom itself. It was in these small acts, in the courage to endure and imagine a life beyond chains, that the seeds of a greater struggle for equality were sown, a struggle that would echo through history, reminding us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can claim a freedom that no celebration, no proclamation, and no chains can fully suppress. Even beyond the fields and kitchens where enslaved black people labored under the relentless gaze of their owners, there existed another layer of experience for those who were legally free, a layer defined by fragile liberty, constant scrutiny, and the weight of a society that refused to recognize their full humanity. In the northern cities where small black communities had managed to carve out spaces of autonomy, life on July 4th, 1776, was far from a simple celebration of independence. Free black men walked the cobblestone streets of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, carrying the heavy burden of social and legal restrictions that made their freedom conditional, a precarious status that could be stripped away at any moment, even on a day supposedly dedicated to liberty. Their labor remained menial, their presence scrutinized, and their very identity constantly questioned. They might be found hauling barrels along the bustling docks, clearing streets for celebrations, or performing the endless domestic and service tasks that white society allowed them. Their bodies and skills exploited to maintain the celebrations of freedom that they could not fully partake in. Their work, though free in name, often mirrored the demands placed on those still in bondage, a cruel irony that underscored the limitations of their social position and the persistent inequalities that freedom alone could not erase. Women, too, experienced this constrained existence acutely, their freedom circumscribed by societal expectations, gendered labor, and the omnipresent threat of exploitation or abduction. In kitchens, laundries, and workshops, free black women prepared meals, polished silver, washed linens, and performed countless tasks for families who raised glasses to ideals of liberty, equality, and self-governance, all while knowing that the law offered little protection against harassment or kidnapping. Their skill and diligence were essential to the day's grandeur, yet the applause and celebration were reserved for others. A constant reminder that freedom carried strings as invisible as they were suffocating. Even as children played or danced in modest courtyards, parents reminded them of the fragility of their liberty, that every step taken in public spaces was measured against the possibility of being challenged, harassed, or forcibly removed from the lives they had worked so tirelessly to maintain. In many, their freedom was not a right but a negotiated existence, a delicate balance between asserting agency and surviving in a society that viewed their autonomy with suspicion, often punishing confidence or boldness with swift and unforgiving consequences. The legal framework of the time further cemented the tenuous nature of freedom for black individuals. They were often required to register with local authorities, carry documentation proving their free status, and constantly navigate a web of laws designed to monitor, control, and constrain them. Without proper papers, even those who had never known the weight of chains could be accused of being runaway slaves, an accusation that carried the terrifying possibility of sale into bondage or incarceration. This constant vigilance extended beyond paperwork into daily interactions, as any encounter with white colonists could become a test of composure. Social navigation and survival. A simple disagreement in the marketplace, an inadvertent crossing of paths in a tavern, or the wrong expression at a public gathering could provoke retaliation, reinforcing the understanding that freedom, for them, was never fully theirs to claim. It was a precarious state, a fragile veneer of liberty that could crack under the pressures of social prejudice. Economic dependency and legal manipulation. Even within their communities, free black individuals understood that their freedom was not absolute, but contingent on the endurance of networks, support systems, and mutual aid. Families and neighbors relied on each other for protection, information, and the careful sharing of resources that could mitigate the constant dangers they faced. Churches, secret societies, and informal gatherings became havens, spaces where education, cultural preservation, and spiritual sustenance flourished despite the surrounding oppression. On July 4th, as white colonists paraded, toasted, and celebrated, these gatherings might quietly continue behind closed doors, a subtle assertion of agency and identity, a reformation of belonging and humanity. In these moments, freedom was expressed not through public recognition or legal decree, but through the ability to nurture kinship, preserve culture, and maintain dignity in the face of a society that refused to extend it fully. Even labor, though necessary for survival, became an arena of both vulnerability and subtle defiance. Men and women, though free, often performed the hardest, dirtiest, and least rewarding work, and yet they maneuvered through it with strategies of resilience. A delayed chore, a quietly withheld favor, or careful subversion of the expectations placed upon them could communicate autonomy and self-respect without provoking outright retribution. These small, strategic acts, seemingly invisible to the broader celebratory world, were vital ways to assert presence, identity, and resistance. They were reminders that even within constrained circumstances, free black individuals were agents of their own lives, negotiating the boundaries of society with intelligence, courage, and endurance. On that July 4th, 1776, the paradox of freedom for black individuals was starkly visible. In a world where white Americans celebrated self-determination, black people navigated a complex landscape of conditional liberty, legal oversight, and social suspicion. Balancing work, survival, and subtle defiance in ways that required constant awareness and resilience. Their freedom was neither guaranteed nor complete. It was fragile, carefully maintained, and perpetually at risk. Yet, within these constraints, free black communities cultivated identity, solidarity, and quiet resistance, preserving the possibility of genuine autonomy for future generations. This conditional freedom underscored the deep contradictions of a society that proclaimed liberty while denying it to a significant portion of its population, revealing that true independence and equality remained a distant aspiration, one nurtured through resilience, community, and the enduring pursuit of justice. As the sun rose on July 4, 1776, and the streets of Philadelphia filled with the sounds of celebration, a striking contradiction lay at the heart of the nation's newfound declaration. The very document that would be celebrated for generations as a symbol of liberty and equality had been meticulously crafted to exclude the people whose labor and suffering underpinned the colony's wealth and power. Thomas Jefferson, a figure celebrated for his eloquence and his role in articulating the ideals of a free nation, penned words that resonated with timeless power, declaring that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet, Jefferson himself was a slaveholder, overseeing the lives of hundreds of men, women, and children who labored under his ownership, many of whom remained ignorant of the words being written in their presence. The stark disparity between principle and practice was not accidental but deliberate, a reflection of the political and economic calculations that shaped the nation's founding. Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration had condemned the British monarchy for perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade, calling it an execrable commerce and vile stain on humanity. But the delegates from the southern colonies, whose wealth and influence depended on the continued subjugation of enslaved people, demanded that any critique of slavery be removed. Even many northern delegates, whose prosperity was tied to industries connected to the trade and use of enslaved labor, acquiesced, prioritizing unity over the moral contradictions embedded in the text. In the end, the Declaration celebrated freedom while leaving the institution of slavery untouched, a glaring hypocrisy that echoed across the lives of enslaved and free black people alike, highlighting the selective application of liberty that would define early American society. For the enslaved population, the words of the Declaration were more than abstract ideals. They were an invisible mirror reflecting the impossibility of their inclusion in the vision of the new nation. Those who had the rare chance to hear the document read aloud in public squares or private gatherings encountered a cruel paradox. Language meant to inspire hope and courage for some carried in its silence a reminder of exclusion and oppression for others. The phrase "all men are created equal" reverberated through spaces where human beings were counted as property, their names recorded in ledgers as commodities, their children subject to sale without consent, and their daily lives dictated by the whims of their owners. The eloquence of Jefferson's prose clashed violently with the grim realities of bondage, creating a cognitive and emotional dissonance that many enslaved individuals could neither ignore nor reconcile. For literate enslaved people, who were rare due to widespread prohibitions against black education, reading the Declaration might have been an act of revelation and heartbreak, uncovering both the promise of a society that could have included them and the deliberate omission that ensured it would not. For those who could only hear the words spoken, the message was equally complex. Liberty was celebrated, yes, but it was a liberty defined without them. A liberty that reinforced their continued marginalization and suffering even mid a national euphoria. The hypocrisy extended beyond Jefferson himself to the broader social and political structures of the colonies, exposing how economic interests and the desire for cohesion among the founding class often outweighed moral clarity. Southern delegates, whose agricultural fortunes were built on the labor of enslaved people, understood that any explicit denunciation of slavery threatened not only their wealth but their social power, and they were willing to leverage their influence to ensure that the Declaration remained silent on this central contradiction. Northern merchants, shipowners, and financiers, who indirectly profited from the transatlantic trade in enslaved people or from industries dependent on slave-produced goods, often agreed to compromise, prioritizing economic stability over the moral imperative that Jefferson had attempted to assert. The careful erasure of anti-slavery language in the final document illustrates the degree to which the Founding Fathers were willing to accommodate the preservation of slavery in the name of political unity, revealing the structural entrenchment of racial inequality even as the nation professed universal ideals. This deliberate omission ensured that while independence would be celebrated as a revolutionary triumph against British tyranny, it would simultaneously reinforce a domestic hierarchy in which black lives were commodified, controlled, and systematically excluded from the promises of freedom being articulated in public squares and newspapers across the colonies. For free black individuals, the Declaration's omissions were equally significant, demonstrating that their legal freedom did not translate to genuine equality, even those who had navigated the complex networks of documentation, registration, and social negotiation to secure liberty faced constant reminders of its fragility. As white citizens raised glasses and cheered for independence, free black men and women navigated spaces fraught with risk, understanding that the promises articulated in Jefferson's prose were not written for them. Their labor contributed to the celebrations. Their skills enabled the pomp and pageantry, and yet the social, legal, and political structures of the time circumscribed their lives in ways that echoed the exclusions faced by the enslaved. The deliberate omission of anti-slavery language from the Declaration underscored that freedom, in practice, was conditional and contingent, a precarious state maintained by vigilance, resilience, and the careful cultivation of community networks that allowed black individuals to preserve identity and agency in a society that systematically sought to deny both. In witnessing these contradictions, both enslaved and free black people engaged in forms of quiet resistance, internalizing the stark disparities between principle and practice while fostering strategies for survival, defiance, and eventual empowerment. The Declaration's rhetoric became a lens through which they could discern both the hypocrisy of the founding class and the possibilities of a future where its promises might one day be extended to them. Its omissions were not merely absences of text but reminders that liberty in 1776 was a selective gift, distributed according to race, status, and economic expediency. Yet even within that framework, the seeds of awareness, resistance, and aspiration were sown, quietly shaping the consciousness and strategies of black communities who would carry the fight for genuine equality forward through decades of struggle, labor, and perseverance. In this tension between lofty ideals and brutal realities, the story of July 4th, 1776, emerges as a complex tapestry of celebration, exclusion, and enduring hope, demonstrating how even the most foundational documents of a nation can reflect both its highest aspirations and its deepest contradictions. Even as the Declaration of Independence was being celebrated with fanfare in cities and towns, the reality for those who lived in chains was defined not by fireworks or parades, but by the quiet, persistent struggle to assert their own humanity in a world determined to deny it. Enslaved men and women navigated the daily grind of labor with a constant awareness of their vulnerability, their bodies compelled to toil in fields, homes, and workshops while their minds and spirits sought refuge in subtler forms of rebellion. Each day became a balancing act, a careful negotiation between survival and resistance, where small gestures carried enormous significance. In the sweltering heat of southern fields, hands blistered and backs bent under the relentless demands of work, enslaved people found ways to push back, slowing the pace of labor when possible, feigning fatigue or illness to gain brief reprieves from tasks designed to break both body and will, and occasionally damaging tools or equipment to frustrate the unyielding demands of their owners. These acts, though modest on the surface, were deliberate choices asserting agency in a system engineered to eliminate it. A language of defiance intelligible only to those who shared their oppression and invisible to those who wielded power over them. Within the confines of enslaved life, resistance was not limited to physical or labor-related acts, but extended into the realm of culture, memory, and spirit. Music became a lifeline, a coded means of communication, and a repository of collective identity, with rhythms and lyrics carrying hidden messages about escape routes, warnings of patrols, or expressions of grief, hope, and determination. Spiritual practices, often syncretized from African traditions and Christian teachings, offered a framework through which enslaved communities could articulate dreams of freedom, endure suffering, and maintain connections to a heritage deliberately suppressed by the institution of slavery. Storytelling played a similarly vital role, transmitting knowledge, preserving ancestral wisdom, and reinforcing a sense of shared history and resilience that could not be recorded in written ledgers or sanctioned by colonial authorities. These cultural forms were themselves acts of defiance, asserting that even in the absence of legal or social recognition, enslaved people retained an inner life and communal identity immune to the full control of their owners. The daily navigation of work, punishment, and fleeting moments of autonomy required vigilance, creativity, and an acute understanding of human behavior. Enslaved individuals observed the rhythms and weaknesses of their overseers, learned to exploit gaps in supervision, and developed networks of communication that allowed for coordinated acts of resistance without drawing the full force of retaliation. From whispered conversations under the cover of night to messages embedded in songs sung aloud during labor. These strategies fostered solidarity and maintained a sense of possibility, nurturing the belief that freedom, though distant, was neither unimaginable nor unattainable. Every slowed task, every minor sabotage, and every shared story became a brick in the foundation of personal and communal empowerment, a way to assert presence in a world that sought to erase it. Resistance also manifested in subtler acts of self-assertion, such as maintaining family ties despite the constant threat of separation, passing down names, traditions, and knowledge to children, and finding ways to cultivate dignity and personal identity even under the most dehumanizing circumstances. The ability to care for one another, to celebrate small moments of joy, and to sustain cultural practices that were meaningful and affirming represented a powerful counter-narrative to the ideology of slavery, asserting that even in bondage, human spirit and moral agency could not be fully extinguished. Enslaved communities recognized that endurance itself was a form of resistance, a rejection of the idea that oppression could define the totality of their existence, and that survival, mental, emotional, and spiritual, was an assertion of autonomy in the most constrained of conditions. The cumulative effect of these daily acts of defiance was a complex, layered form of resistance that often went unnoticed by the broader society yet carried profound implications for the future. They demonstrated that oppression, no matter how entrenched or violently enforced, could never fully suppress human creativity, solidarity, and aspiration. Songs that encoded hope, stories that preserved memory, and feigned compliance that masked strategic defiance all contributed to a tapestry of resilience that would echo through generations, informing the cultural, social, and political struggles that would eventually challenge the institution of slavery itself. These acts were not dramatic revolutions on the scale of battlefields or political upheaval, but were nonetheless revolutionary in their quiet insistence that enslaved people were not merely property to be moved, sold, or broken, but thinking, feeling, and capable beings who could shape their own destinies in the smallest, most significant ways. In this landscape of everyday resistance, enslaved people transformed ordinary tasks into arenas of moral and spiritual assertion, turning labor, song, storytelling, and communal ritual into tools of survival and empowerment. The workday was not simply a series of imposed actions, but a canvas on which strategies of defiance and resilience were carefully painted. Where the rhythm of a hammer, the cadence of a field song, or the telling of a tale could carry layers of meaning intelligible only to those immersed in the shared struggle for dignity and freedom. Every action, no matter how minor it appeared to the outside observer, became part of a continuum of defiance, a living testament to the capacity of enslaved communities to resist erasure and assert humanity even when the official narratives of liberty and independence explicitly excluded them. By embracing culture, creativity, and subtle rebellion, enslaved people forged a world within the world imposed upon them, ensuring that their voices, stories, and spirits could not be fully silenced even as the nation celebrated its promises of freedom without them, creating a legacy of resilience that would endure long after the fireworks faded and the words of the Declaration had been etched into history. As the revolutionary fervor swept through the colonies, the question of allegiance and survival took on a deeply personal and often perilous dimension for Black people, whose lives were defined by both oppression and the fragile possibilities of freedom. For the enslaved, the American Revolution was not simply a political upheaval or a distant struggle over taxation and governance. It was an immediate and existential question of life, death, and liberty that required navigating treacherous choices with incomplete information and often devastating consequences. When the British forces issued promises of freedom to enslaved people who escaped from their rebel masters, these proclamations were not abstract enticements, but tangible opportunities to reclaim autonomy in a world structured to deny it. The offer came with immense risk. To flee was to defy both legal and social authority, to place oneself in the hands of a foreign power, and to gamble that these promises would be honored in a chaotic wartime landscape. Yet for many, the potential to exchange chains for the uncertainty of military service was a gamble worth taking. A chance to assert agency and seek the freedom that had been systematically withheld for generations. Simultaneously, the Continental Army presented a different set of calculations. Some enslaved men were allowed to enlist with the promise of eventual emancipation, a path fraught with uncertainty and compromise, while service in the revolutionary forces offered a legal route toward freedom. It required not only physical courage, but also the willingness to subordinate one's immediate autonomy to the larger objectives of a rebellion that, at its heart, was primarily concerned with the liberty of white Americans. The very notion of fighting for a nation that had explicitly excluded them from its founding ideals was paradoxical. Yet enlistment represented a strategic choice, a bet that personal sacrifice in service to a larger cause could yield tangible results. A demonstration of valor that could be leveraged into recognition, rights, or at least survival. The decision was never simple, for the promise of freedom was contingent on military success, personal conduct, and the whims of local authorities, leaving those who enlisted to navigate a precarious landscape where every act carried potential life or death consequences. For those who remained on plantations, whether by choice, circumstance, or lack of viable alternatives, survival itself became a complex form of negotiation. Staying behind often meant enduring the continuation of harsh labor and constant surveillance. But it also allowed individuals to maintain familial connections, to continue cultural practices in relative proximity to their communities, and to observe the shifting political dynamics around them in ways that could inform future decisions. Within these spaces, enslaved people exercise subtle forms of agency, such as clandestine communication, preserving stories and traditions, and building networks of support that could provide both immediate aid and long-term strategies for resistance or escape. The act of remaining on a plantation was therefore not passive acceptance, but a tactical engagement with the realities imposed by a society that offered freedom in words but constrained it in practice, highlighting the complex interplay between endurance, strategy, and hope. The choices available to Black people during the Revolution revealed the intricate moral, practical, and emotional calculus required to navigate a society structured by racial hierarchy and entrenched slavery. Each decision whether to flee to British lines, enlist with revolutionary forces, or stay within familiar confines entailed weighing immediate safety against long-term aspirations, the well-being of family against personal liberty, and the unpredictable consequences of trust and betrayal. These were decisions made without clear guidance, often under immense pressure and with incomplete knowledge of the outcomes, demonstrating the acute intelligence, moral fortitude, and strategic thinking that enslaved and free Black people employed in the pursuit of survival and dignity. In making these choices, they were forced to grapple with questions of loyalty, identity, and self-determination, revealing the profound ethical dimensions embedded in the struggle for freedom. Across all these paths, the act of decision-making itself became an expression of resistance and self-assertion. To consider one's options, to deliberate over the best course of action in a context designed to deny deliberation, was itself a reclaiming of agency, a refusal to be entirely defined by circumstance. The very process of evaluating risk and opportunity, of imagining possible futures beyond the immediate constraints of enslavement, reinforced a sense of personhood and strategic foresight that contradicted the narratives imposed by slaveholders and political leaders alike. It was in these moments, whether under the threat of violence, the uncertainty of exile, or the promise of conditional freedom, that Black individuals navigated the contours of autonomy and survival, crafting lives defined by ingenuity, resilience, and moral courage in the midst of a revolution that celebrated liberty while withholding it from half the population. These decisions also illuminated the broader contradictions of the revolutionary era. A war fought in the name of freedom yet sustained by the labor of the unfree. A rhetoric of universal rights shadowed by systemic exclusion, and a society that invited some to fight for liberty while leaving others to suffer under its denial. The choices made by Black people, whether to align with British forces, enlist with the Continental Army, or remain on plantations underscore not only the complexity of survival under oppressive conditions but also the enduring human desire for self-determination, justice, and dignity. Each path, fraught with danger and uncertainty, became a testament to the capacity of individuals to exercise moral judgment, strategic foresight, and courage in circumstances that offered little guarantee of reward or recognition. In recounting these stories, the revolutionary period emerges not simply as a struggle between colonists and imperial forces, but as a deeply human narrative of calculated risk, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of freedom in the face of formidable constraints. A narrative that challenges simplified notions of loyalty, heroism, and the meaning of liberty in a society built on unequal foundations. In the midst of a society built upon the systematic dehumanization of Black people, both enslaved and free families carved out fragile but meaningful spaces of connection and resilience, creating bonds that could not be entirely severed by the pervasive forces of oppression. On plantations where the whips of overseers marked the rhythm of the day, enslaved parents found ways to teach their children, often in whispers and hidden corners, about their ancestry, the stories of those who had endured before them, and the rhythms of music and faith that connected them to a broader cultural heritage deliberately obscured by enslavers. These moments of quiet instruction were acts of resistance as much as they were gestures of love, ensuring that knowledge, pride, and identity survived in a world determined to erase them. A lullaby hummed in the shadows, a story shared in the dark, a secret prayer whispered before dawn, each became a thread weaving the continuity of family and community, binding individuals together across the forced separations imposed by sales, labor demands, and the unpredictable tides of war. Free black families, though not bound to chains, lived under constant threat, navigating legal restrictions, economic limitations, and the looming danger of kidnapping or harassment. Yet they too cultivated networks of support and solidarity. Neighbors became surrogate kin. Informal schools and gatherings became spaces to teach children reading, history, and moral values, and communal events offered occasions to celebrate culture and reinforce a sense of collective belonging. These chosen families and communities operated as a lifeline, sustaining emotional health, providing practical aid, and fostering a sense of identity that was both defiant and enduring. The resilience of these families was not simply an adaptation to adversity, but a deliberate construction of a life and society that affirmed their humanity and worth, countering a social order intent on marginalization and erasure. Across both enslaved and free populations, the preservation of heritage and the formation of supportive networks were inseparable from the broader struggle for agency and autonomy. In the shadow of the July 4th celebrations that heralded liberty for white Americans, these acts of familial and cultural continuity represented a quiet but profound assertion of freedom. Children learned the names and deeds of ancestors, absorbing lessons that would shape their understanding of the world and their place within it, cultivating a sense of moral and cultural grounding that no legal code could erase. Elders and adults stood as guardians of memory, passing down wisdom in ways that were accessible even under surveillance, ensuring that the future would carry forward knowledge of resilience, courage, and identity. These efforts were frequently intertwined with acts of spiritual sustenance, from clandestine worship and prayer meetings to storytelling and the performance of music, all of which reinforced both communal bonds and individual fortitude. The creation of chosen families and networks of solidarity also served as a practical mechanism for survival. Enslaved people separated from biological kin often relied on the support and protection of fellow community members, forming bonds of loyalty and mutual assistance that could provide food, shelter, or guidance when threatened by the arbitrary violence of slaveholders. These relationships were not merely functional but deeply emotional, fostering trust, affection, and a sense of belonging that transcended the transactional logic imposed by the institution of slavery. In free communities, similar dynamics played out in a different context. Neighbors and friends provided childcare, education, and assistance in times of illness or economic hardship, creating a web of interdependence that strengthened communal resilience. Both enslaved and free families demonstrated ingenuity in negotiating constraints, converting limited resources, shared knowledge, and emotional labor into mechanisms of survival and endurance that were as essential as any material provision. Cultural preservation was inseparable from these familial practices, embedding resilience within the very fabric of everyday life. Music, storytelling, and religious practice functioned not merely as entertainment or ritual, but as repositories of identity and memory, teaching children and adults alike the values, histories, and strategies necessary to navigate a world structured by oppression. Songs contained coded messages, stories conveyed moral lessons and survival strategies, and prayer offered both solace and a framework for envisioning liberation. These cultural forms reinforced familial and communal cohesion, allowing individuals to maintain a sense of agency and self-worth even when external circumstances sought to diminish both. The deliberate transmission of knowledge and tradition was thus both an act of preservation and a subtle form of resistance, asserting that life, memory, and dignity could endure despite systemic efforts at erasure. The emotional dimensions of these practices were profound, encompassing joy, sorrow, hope, and mourning, often intertwined in ways that reflected the complexities of lived experience under oppression. Celebrations of birthdays, weddings, or seasonal rituals took on heightened significance, providing brief reprieves from labor and surveillance while reinforcing communal bonds and intergenerational connections. The act of gathering, of sharing food, stories, or song, was simultaneously a claim to humanity and a reinforcement of resilience, allowing participants to experience moments of agency and pleasure in a world designed to limit both. Children internalized lessons of cooperation, courage, and cultural pride, learning from example how to navigate a society that constrained freedom yet could not entirely contain the human spirit. Through these persistent, intentional efforts to maintain connection, identity, and support, Black families, enslaved and free alike, demonstrated the profound ways in which human beings respond to oppression with creativity, courage, and love. These acts of resilience, often invisible to outsiders and absent from dominant historical narratives, were fundamental to survival, shaping the lives of generations and leaving a legacy of cultural endurance that continues to inform understandings of freedom, family, and community today. In telling these stories, it becomes evident that the history of Black families during this era is not solely one of suffering or subjugation, but also one of agency, resourcefulness, and profound moral and emotional fortitude, revealing the depth of human capacity to sustain life, memory, and identity even under the harshest of conditions. As the sun rose on July 4, 1776, the celebrations of liberty rang out for white Americans, a spectacle of fireworks, parades, and patriotic fervor. Yet for 500,000 enslaved Black people, the day remained a stark reminder of the freedoms they were denied. Over the decades that followed, however, the meaning of independence evolved, shaped in no small measure by the courage, resilience, and relentless advocacy of Black individuals and communities who refused to accept the promises of freedom as a privilege reserved only for others. What began as a day that excluded, silenced, and marginalized gradually became a platform for Black resistance, a symbol of both struggle and hope, and ultimately a rallying point for movements that demanded the nation live up to the ideals it proclaimed. Enslaved and free Black people alike transformed July 4th into an occasion for asserting their humanity and demanding recognition. Through speeches, petitions, and public demonstrations, early abolitionists seized the moment to confront the contradictions of a nation that celebrated liberty while maintaining bondage. Figures such as Frederick Douglass, who famously delivered his "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech, articulated the pain, irony, and injustice of the day with eloquence and moral authority, challenging the broader society to reconcile its ideals with its practices. These efforts revealed that independence, true independence, could not be achieved while millions remained in chains, and they set the stage for generations of activists who would continue to push for equality, justice, and recognition. During the 19th century, abolitionist societies, Black newspapers, and literary voices expanded the platform of July 4th, blending celebration with critique, patriotism with protest. Communities organized parades, readings, and commemorations that honored the principles of liberty, while foregrounding the ongoing struggle for emancipation. Churches and community organizations served as hubs for education and political engagement, preparing people to advocate for systemic change and cultivating networks of solidarity that strengthened the push toward freedom. In this way, July 4th became more than a reminder of exclusion. It became a day of assertion, of public witness, and of envisioning a society where the promises of the Declaration of Independence could be realized for all. The post-Civil War era marked another transformation in the significance of July 4th for Black Americans. With the abolition of slavery and the ratification of constitutional amendments intended to guarantee civil rights, the day carried a new weight, celebrating not only formal freedom, but the ongoing struggle to claim the full benefits of citizenship. Free people celebrated with speeches, parades, and community gatherings, asserting their rightful place within the nation while confronting the persistent realities of discrimination, violence, and systemic inequality. The 4th of July became a lens through which the gap between the nation's ideals and its practices could be scrutinized, critiqued, and challenged, maintaining the day's dual role as both a reminder of historical exclusion and a platform for empowerment. Into the 20th century, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, July 4th continued to be a day of reflection and mobilization. Activists, writers, and leaders invoked the principles of independence to demand voting rights, educational equality, and protection under the law. The day became an occasion to draw national attention to injustices, highlight ongoing struggles, and remind the broader society that liberty must be inclusive to be meaningful. Across towns, cities, and rural communities, the celebrations intertwined with activism, forming a cultural memory in which independence was inseparable from the fight for justice, dignity, and equality. This transformation of July 4th illustrates the resilience and agency of Black Americans in reshaping public memory and national identity. From a day that initially symbolized their exclusion, Black people turned it into a vehicle for resistance, a marker of cultural endurance, and a platform for advocacy. Through speeches, parades, literary works, and grassroots activism, they asserted that independence was not a static historical event but an ongoing struggle requiring vigilance, courage, and collective effort. By reclaiming the day, they reminded the nation that liberty must be lived and defended, not merely celebrated in ritual, and that the ideals enshrined in founding documents carry moral weight only when they are extended to all. Today, the story of July 4th for Black Americans serves as both a lesson and an inspiration. It underscores the power of resilience, the importance of historical awareness, and the necessity of advocacy to ensure that the promises of freedom are realized for everyone. The day challenges us to reflect on the past, confront ongoing inequities, and recognize the contributions, sacrifices, and struggles of those whose voices were historically marginalized. It is a testament to the enduring capacity of human beings to turn exclusion into empowerment, oppression into action, and denial into the assertion of rights. By acknowledging this history, we honor those who fought tirelessly for justice and reaffirm our collective responsibility to uphold the principles of liberty and equality in every generation. Thank you for joining us in exploring this critical part of our shared history. If you found this story enlightening, please like, subscribe, and share to help spread awareness and keep these important conversations alive. Your support ensures that the lessons of the past continue to inform and inspire the pursuit of justice and equality today.